I used to think that Groo always wore a little pouch with a skull on his belt. Then I noticed a drawing of him without it. Then I noticed a whole comic where he wasn't wearing them. Then I started seeing or not seeing that pouch and skull all over the place. Today, I'm going to show you how I solved the mystery of Groo's missing skull. Not that skull. Hi, I'm Darren and these are my hands, and this is GrooTube, where we appreciate the art of Aragonés. Today, we're investigating the mystery of Groo's little pouch and skull. After I noticed in the early days that Sergio didn't draw Groo with his pouch and skull, I decided I needed to find out two things about the origins of these items. First, I wanted to know when Sergio started drawing the pouch and skull on Groo, and second, I wanted to know how Groo obtained that pouch and skull. It was actually pretty straightforward to learn how Groo obtained his pouch and skull, but it was an interesting journey discovering when Sergio started drawing them. So let's start there, and in the second half of this video, we'll have a history lesson on how Groo got them. The mystery of the pouch and skull's first appearance. Wouldn't it be great if the pouch and skull were always together and never apart? But early on, Sergio would sometimes draw Groo with a pouch, but mostly not. Take, for example, the cover of Pacific Comics issue number 1, where Groo clearly has a pouch, and the Frank Frazetta-inspired Pacific Comics Groo issue number 4, where Groo also has a pouch. So Groo's pouch isn't what we're going to be focused on. Groo could have picked one up and tossed it away whenever, but the origin of that little skull, that's the treasure we're really on a hunt for. So let's start with these Pacific covers. Issue number 1, Groo has a pouch. Issue number 2, we see no pouch. Issue number 3, we see no pouch, no skull. Issue number 4 has the pouch. Issue number 5, we can't see. Issue number 6, I'm not seeing a pouch or a skull. Issue number 7, nothing to see here. Issue number 8, we can't tell if there's a pouch or a skull there. So let's look at some early epic covers. No pouch, no skull. No pouch or skull to be seen. No pouch, no skull to be seen. Aha! Groo number 4. There is a little skull right there. But let's keep going. No pouch or skull to be seen in issue number 5. Can't see anything in issue 6. Can't see anything in issue 7. In issue 8, clearly the skull is there. Can't see anything in issue 9. Can't see anything in issue 10. Can't see anything in issue 11. And there we go again in issue 12 with the skull and pouch. Wouldn't it have been cool if he got it from the monks in issue 15? All right, let's start looking inside comics to find out where that skull shows up. I've pulled out my copies of the Groo Chronicles so we can look at a lot of early issues in one spot quickly and conveniently. So here we go. No skull. 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 That's a nice coloring of Pacific Comics Groo number 1, and it should be noted that Tom Luth recolored all of the images in the Groo Chronicles. Here's a Sage story. Without a skull. Look at that, that's nice. Let's keep looking for skulls. No. No. None. No skulls. Clearly no skull. Nothing. No skulls. No and no. Let's keep going. Book number 2. Clearly no skull. Dinosaurs. Nothing. Nope. Clearly no skull. No skull here either. That looks nice. Oh, look at this beautiful map. The Travels of the Wanderer. Clearly no skull. Another Sage comic without a skull. Ah, okay. Let's take a look. Uh-oh. This is the first appearance of Groo the Wanderer that showed up in Destroyer Duck. And there's a skull right there. There it is. Hang on, though. Okay. No skull. Yeah, it's there. There's a problem here, though. Check out Groo's nose here. Check out Groo's nose here and Groo's nose here. We already know that this comic has been recolored. Look at his nose there and compare it with his nose here. This is the first Groo nose. This is a different nose. We need to do some detective work here. I suspect there is something going on. In addition to not expecting to see a skull there, these are clearly recolored, and it looks to me like much of the blood and the gore has been taken out of this comic. We need to take a look at Destroyer Duck to find out what these really look like in the early days. Yes, take a look at that. In the original drawings, there was no skull on Groo's belt. And take a look at Groo's nose. This has clearly been redrawn for the Groo Chronicles published by Epic Comics. They were probably held to a higher standard with regards to blood and gore, and Sergio changed things up a bit and added the skull after the fact. Totally. Look at the difference in that nose. Very interesting. All right, we do know that Groo had a pouch very early on, but what about this skull? It did not first appear when Groo first appeared. Let's continue looking through these early Groo comics. This comic is from Star Slayer number 6, and I see no skull. Nope. Here's a Sage story with no Groo and no skull, and then we have this 4-page Groo story from Epic Illustrated 27 with no skulls by the pouch. All right, we'll continue. Turn of the wheel. Lots of skulls, but not on Groo's pouch. Nope, nope, nope. More skulls, but not for Groo. Oh, is this thing a sling? Still nothing. Oh, what a nice job of coloring that cover. Well done, Tom. Ooh, very early Groo. No skull. Looking at Shanghai. Clearly finding no skulls. Nothing. Wow, that looks great. And glad that there are no skulls. Fantastic map. Wonderful early Groo with no skull. Would you believe me if I said I went through my collection of PC Groos and there's no skulls in the story? I hope you would. Let's take a look inside Epic Comics Groos now. Groo number 1. Clear view of the pouch. Clearly no skull. That's a map. That's no skull. No skull. No skull. Let's take a look at Groo number 2. April 1985. No skull. Clearly no skull. No. Not a skull. No skull in issue number 2. Epic issue number 3, May 1985. Clearly no skull. I see no skull. If there was a skull, you would see it here, or here, or here, or here. No skull. None. No. Where's the skull? It's not here. It's not anywhere in this issue. All right. Here we have Groo number 4 from June of 1985. And on the cover, clearly the pouch has the skull. And we note that this cover was drawn and inked in 1984. But entertain my hypothesis that Groo on the cover is drawn in a newer style than Groo on the inside. The nose and the eyes are quite the giveaway. Beady eyes, not as bulbous of a nose. No skull. Clearly no skull. No skull. No skull. What's this? A skull. But take a look at the cartoony nature of Groo's face and the bulbousness of his nose. It's like pillowy round compared to this nose and compared to this nose. This could be a redrawn panel, but we'll keep an open mind. No skull. Flatter nose. Way flat nose. No skull. Long face. Flat nose. Beady eyes. No skull, no skull, no skull, no skull. Clearly no skull, no skull. Seems like that was an anomaly a few pages back. No skull. No skull. Not a skull. That guy kind of looks like Groo because he's wearing orange clothes, has straight long brown hair, and headband. So there's a skull on the cover, and there's one panel that has a skull on the inside. June 1985, this was published. This was drawn in 1984 sometime. I contend that that one panel with a skull was a redraw. We'll see. Let's go faster. I'm only going to stop when I see a skull at this point. Right there. Clearly no skull up to this point, but there's one right there. Okay, let's see what happens in the rest of the issue. Nope. Just this one skull in issue number 5. Could it be a redraw? It certainly is inconsistent with the rest of the issue. At least Tom colored it this time. Issue number 6, going fast. Clearly this is old style Groo. Old style Groo. I'm seeing no skulls as I flip the pages. And now Groo's getting rid of his clothes, dressed up as a woman. There's his clothes, there's his pouch. I don't see a skull. Not one there either. No skull. Could it be that in issues 4 and 5 there were redraws where Sergio added the skull? You can make up your own mind. Let's blast through issue 7. We'll only stop for skulls. There is a skull. There's not a skull. There is a skull. There's not a skull. And a sage story. So in issue 7, we have a couple skulls, and we have many instances where there should be skulls, and there were no skulls. Issue number 8, skull on the cover, October 1985. This cover was drawn in 1985. No skulls. Skull. No pouch at all. No skull. No skull. No skull. No. Yes. No. Yes. 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 No. Well, the skull is certainly not absent. It's not consistent. We might be getting towards 50% skull and 50% non-skull at this point. Groo number 9, November 1985. Can't see it. Clearly not there. Definitely a skull. No skull, but maybe it's hiding around his back. Maybe it's tucked around the front. Hard to draw too many conclusions from this one other than inconsistency. I would think that we would see a skull here. There it is. There's the skull. 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 Not absolutely consistent, but in almost every place that we should expect to see the skull is there. In issue number 10, December 1985. Let's take a quick look at January 1986, issue 11. There's a skull. There's a nice big skull. I think that might be a skull. There's a skull. There's a skull. There's a skull. Skull. No skull. Skull. The skull must be just behind the pouch at this point. Skull. Skull. I would be willing to concede that by Epic 10, definitely by 11, Sergio is trying to have that skull in place in all the drawings of Groo where we should see the skull. Looking at all of these Groo comics, the stories and the covers, taking into account that stories could be drawn months ahead of inking where changes could occur, and that completed inked stories, which would also have to be colored by Tom, would be finished by Sergio months ahead of publication, and that comics have a publication date often well ahead of the date they hit the newsstands, and that Sergio could be drawing covers for these issues much later than when he inks and delivers a finished comic. I think that Sergio began to draw Groo with his pouch and his skull towards the end of 1984. And I'm going to cite the cover of Epic Groo number 4 with this 1984 date. Perhaps he drew it in December of 1984 with this skull. And then he's becoming consistent with his skull placement inside the stories, taking a look at Epic Groo number 10 and number 11, December of 1985 and January of 1986. Perhaps they were finally inked in mid-1985. This would allow for a couple covers and a few panels in the comics leading up to number 10 being redrawn closer to publication with a skull. The mystery of how Groo obtained that little skull. As we read through the monthly Groo comics, there's no indication of how Groo got that little skull, or what it is, so we have to go beyond the pages of Epic Groo the Wanderer to learn of its canonical in-story origin. But you don't have to be too keen of eye to see the exact moment. All you need is 1983's The Life of Groo graphic novel. Only $11.20 Canadian. That's quite a bargain. The Life of Groo tells the story of how an evil mind-reading wizard curses Groo's parents by causing their firstborn son to be born without the ability to think. This, of course, is Groo, and over the years, Groo is loved by his mother, separated from his parents, returns, and again is separated from them. Throughout the story, we notice that Groo's father wears a little pouch and a skull on his belt. As a young man, and clearly sometime after he obtains his swords from Fushikaka, Groo learns that his parents are being held in the dungeon of Batu. After defeating Batu and rescuing his parents, Groo begins his life as a wanderer, with his parents' blessing and with a gift from his father's own pouch and little skull. So now we know how Groo received his pouch and skull, but what is it? For that, let's turn to Groograms, the letter pages. Here we have Epic Issue 24 from February 1987. The question from Dave Wilson is, what is the skull from on Groo's belt? And Mark Evanire's answer is, that's Groo when he was a baby. And of course, that's a joke answer. So let's find the right answer in Epic Groo number 65 from May of 1990. Mark D. Warner writes in with a totally serious letter explaining not only what the little skull is, but what that blue thing on the straps across Groo's chest is, and the proper name of Groo's knife. Here's what Mark Warner writes about the skull. That little white skull on Groo's belt is called a Netsuke and is an ornamental button used to hold his pouch on his belt by preventing the thong from slipping. No, not that kind of thong. Groo in a thong might be worse than Groo's bare backside. Mark Evanire replies, without noticeable sarcasm either, you have come up with a genuine answer to a couple of the questions most asked of us here at Groo Central. Not that that will keep folks from asking, but thanks for the data. So there you go. Groo's little skull hanging from his pouch is a Japanese Netsuke. Netsuke? Netsuke. Netsuke. I don't know. Netsuke. Let's put our own little skull on this mystery. Sergio begins drawing the pouch with the little skull called a Netsuke in late 1984. And in Groo's story, he receives the particular skull and pouch he wears from his father after rescuing his father and mother from the dungeons of Batu. Working with these discoveries, it seems that would have happened around the time Groo was traveling with Arcadio on the quest of the Goblet of Tervel. Well, Groo friends, let me know if this theory makes sense to you and straighten me out in the comments if I've erred. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications because I'll be back soon with some more GrooTube. What's that? You're still here? You want me to turn over Groo number 6 from Pacific Comics so we can see the actual front side of the comic? Why would you want that? Oh, this thing here? Yeah, it looks like Groo might have a Netsuke on the front cover of Pacific Comics Groo number 6. Well, you know this story, The Wizard War, it could have taken place much farther along in the Groo timeline. Or Gravito the Wizard could have put it on Groo's belt. Or maybe Groo only had it for the cover of this issue and got rid of it or lost it before his dad gave him his. There's so many ways to explain away these inconsistencies, as I'm sure you understand, Groo fans. Take care.